Imagine a weapon that, by its mere sight, sent entire armies fleeing before the battle even began. It is not a machine gun, not a secret howitzer, and not poison gas. It is just a crude, curved piece of rusty metal that peasants once used to cut grain. But in the hands of men who had lost their minds from thirst and hatred, this tool turned into the most terrifying nightmare of 19th century South America. In this video, we will tell you a story that school textbooks shamefully keep silent about. The story of how yesterday's miners and farmhands took up this knife and transformed into demons who knew no mercy. You will learn why soldiers voluntarily threw away loaded rifles and ran to certain death with nothing but a blade in their teeth. We will reveal shocking details of how heroes destroyed priceless cultural treasures for firewood, and why elite officers were forced to shoot their own men right on the streets of captured cities. But the most gruesome part awaits you at the end. You will see how the perfect killing machine, created to destroy an external enemy, suddenly turned around and began to devour its creators. How national pride turned into national suicide when brother went against brother, with the very same monstrous blade in hand. Watch until the end to understand why the triumphant victory an entire nation dreamed of actually became the beginning of its moral demise. Welcome to hell, paved with good intentions and curved steel. Imagine a wound. Not a neat entrance hole from an 11mm bullet that you can plug with a finger. And not a clean, surgical cut from a straight saber that leaves a noble scar. No. Imagine that flesh met an iron hook that went inside, and then, obeying the killer's wrist, jerked to the side, ripping out a piece of life. Ragged edges, impossible to suture. This is not a wound. This is the mark of the beast. If you, sitting safely in front of your screens, saw the aftermath of a strike with this object, you would look away. But you are here for exactly this. You want to understand how a curved piece of rusty metal, which was only good for cutting grain or cutting ropes on bales, became the worst nightmare of South America in the late 19th century. How a farmer's tool turned into a nation's curse. Look at it. This is the Corvo. At first glance, it seems like a blacksmith's mistake, a freak in the world of cold steel. Its blade is not straight like an arrow, nor gently curved like a cavalryman's saber. It is broken. It curves at a right angle, resembling the beak of a giant predatory condor or the crooked finger of a corpse. 200, sometimes 300 grams of crude steel, a handle made of wood, bone, or simply wrapped in dirty leather so it wouldn't slip in a sweaty palm. No elegance, no guard to protect the hand. This is not a weapon for fencing. This is a weapon to end an argument in one move, forever. You might ask, why such a strange shape? Why this ridiculous hook at the end? The answer is simple and monstrous. A straight blade stabs, it punctures, it gives the victim a chance. The curved blade of the Corvo does not stab, it hooks. It works on the principle of a sickle, but the harvest here is quite different. In close quarters, when you feel the enemy's breath on your face, this curve allows you to strike behind a shield, behind a raised rifle, around the corner of cover. You think you have blocked, but the steel beak finds a loophole, curves around your forearm, and digs into your neck. This is the anatomy of silent horror. The psychology of war changes when the Corvo takes the stage. Artillery shelling is scary, but it is a lottery. A bullet is an instant point. A bayonet is a long needle. All these are instruments of war created in design bureaus. The Corvo came from the earth. It reeks of something ancient, pagan, beastly. When you see a soldier with a bayonet, you see an enemy. When you see a man clutching this curved knife in his hand, with a reverse grip, blade down, point toward himself, you see an executioner. Try to imagine yourself in the place of a Peruvian recruit in the year 1879. You are standing in a trench. Dust clogs your nose. And running toward you is not a disciplined line in beautiful uniforms, but a crowd of ragamuffins who aren't even shooting. They are just running. And clamped in their teeth is this shiny crescent. You know what will happen when they arrive. You have heard the stories. You know that the Corvo leaves no wounded. It takes no prisoners. It is created to rip open, not to injure. Moralists of the 19th century liked to talk about the rules of warfare, about chivalry, about humanism even on the battlefield. The Corvo spits on these rules. Its very geometry denies humanism. A straight blade is a duel. A crooked blade is murder. A strike with a Corvo is called el tajo, or el gancho, the hook. It is delivered not by the strength of the arm, but by the weight of the body and the inertia of the turn. It is a dance, a deadly, ugly dance in the dust. An experienced fighter with such a knife does not just land a blow, he passes through the opponent, leaving silence behind him. Why did this knife become so effective? Because it became an extension of the hand. This is not a metaphor. For those who used it, it was more natural than a fork or a quill pen. They grew up with it. They cut grapes with it, cleaned fish, chopped rope, settled scores in drunken brawls outside taverns. They didn't need army drills to learn how to kill. Life taught them. A cruel, poor, hungry life. When the generals gave them rifles, they took them. But when the ammo ran out, they returned with relief to what they trusted most: to cold steel. There is another aspect rarely written about in history textbooks: sound, or rather, the lack thereof. A rifle thunders, a cannon roars. The Corvo works almost silently. Only heavy breathing, the rustle of fabric, and the wet sound of steel parting from flesh. In night raids, in the narrow gorges of the Andes, in the labyrinth of trenches, this knife created an atmosphere of paranoia. The enemy could be anywhere. Death could come from behind any rock, and it would be silent. This broke the psyche of the defenders faster than massive bombardments. In the world of weapons, there are aristocrats, rapiers, sabers, engraved swords, and there is the Corvo. It is a proletarian. It is a working tool that retrained as a killer. It is crude. It is cheap. It can be made from the spring of a broken wagon, from a file, from any piece of iron found in a dump. It is not a pity to lose it, because it is easy to make a new one. It was this accessibility and mass availability that made it so dangerous. This is not the weapon of elite special forces. It is the weapon of the people. And when the people, driven to a frenzy, take it in their hands, war ceases to be a political conflict. It turns into a massacre. Look closely at the curve of the blade again. Do you see how the light plays on the uneven surface? This knife knows no mercy. It knows no doubt. It knows no fear. It requires only one thing: a steady hand and the determination to cross the line where a human ceases to be human. And unfortunately, in that war, there were plenty of such hands. But who were these people? Who were those whose hands fit so perfectly on the rough handles? Where did they come from, these demons feared even by their own commanders? To understand the nature of the knife, one must understand the nature of the one holding it. One must look into the eyes of those whom society rejected, but whom war called to its front lines. We must go to where this character was forged, to a place where the sun burns out the soul, and the price of a human life is lower than the price of a sip of water. While politicians in Santiago offices were drawing maps of future conquests, in the north, in the white silence of the desert, a new type of soldier was already maturing. A soldier who had nothing to lose. The perfect carrier for the perfect weapon. Welcome to hell. Just not the one where devils fry sinners in pans. In this hell, the ticket is cheaper, and the torments are far more sophisticated. Welcome to the Atacama, the driest place on planet Earth. Here, rain is a legend that old men stopped believing in back in the last century. Here, the sun does not warm, it incinerates, turning skin into parchment in a couple of hours. During the day, it is plus 40 degrees in the shade, which doesn't exist, and at night, the cold chills to the bone, making teeth chatter. It was here, in this white silence of salt and saltpeter, that a creature lived which the stiff elite of Santiago contemptuously called roto. Look at this old photograph. Do you see this man? A torn shirt, pants rolled up to the knees, bare feet, calloused hands ingrained with coal dust or the dirt of copper mines. This is the roto chileno, the ragamuffin, the drifter, a man without roots, without a home, and seemingly without a future. For the gentlemen in top hats and tailcoats drinking coffee in the cozy salons of the capital, these people were invisible. They were draft animals, labor force, a statistical error. They were despised. They were feared. People tried not to notice them. But the roto had one peculiarity. From early childhood, barely having learned to walk, every boy from the slums of Valparaiso or the mining settlements of the north received his first knife. Not a toy, a tool. The Corvo hung on their belt when they went down into the mines, when they worked in the fields, when they drank cheap wine in dirty taverns. This curved piece of steel was their passport, their judge, and their only true friend in a world that didn't give a damn about them. By the end of the year 1879, when the diplomats stopped talking and the cannons began to speak, the world of these people turned upside down. The War of the Pacific, or the Saltpeter War. Sounds silly, right? Thousands of people must die for fossilized bird droppings. But saltpeter back then was the oil of the 19th century. It is fertilizer. It is gunpowder. It is money. Huge, unimaginable money. And when Chile, Peru, and Bolivia could not share this golden sand of the desert, the elite urgently needed those willing to die for their interests. The mobilization was strange. Yesterday's miners, port loaders, and farmhands put on military uniforms, or what was left of them. And that is when the first cultural shock happened. Officers of the Chilean army, raised on European traditions, obsessed with French fashion and Prussian discipline, looked at their soldiers with horror. How to command this horde? How to force them to march in step? How to teach them the noble art of bayonet fighting? The answer was simple. You couldn't. Imagine a parade ground where a sleek lieutenant tries to explain to a group of sullen miners the advantages of a straight bayonet lunge. He talks about distance, about stance, about fencing. And the soldiers listen and grin silently. They know that in a cramped trench, in dust and chaos, this long, clumsy bayonet only gets in the way. They touch the handles of their corvos, hidden in their boot tops or tucked into their belts. They know that when the real work starts, the officers' manuals will fly into the fire. The Atacama Desert became the ideal catalyst. It stripped people of the thin veneer of civilization. Here, among white salt flats and red rocks, it wasn't the smartest or the most educated who survived. The cruelest survived. The fittest. The rotos felt right at home here. They were used to hardship. They could walk 50 kilometers a day with a heavy backpack, having only a sip of stale water in their canteen. They knew how to sleep on rocks. The officers noticed with surprise that these savages possessed incredible endurance and fatalism. They didn't need patriotic speeches. They had their own special pride. The pride of people who had been beaten all their lives, but could never be broken. They went to war not for the president and not for the flag. They went because it was a job. A hard, bloody job for which they were promised pay and food. And also, there one could let out accumulated anger. All the class hatred, all the humiliations they had endured for years were compressed into a tight ball of rage. And the only outlet for this energy became the Corvo blade. Legends circulated in the camps. They whispered that Peruvians and Bolivians were not just enemies, but devils who wanted to take the Chileans' lawful loot away. Propaganda worked crudely, but effectively. But the environment itself was scarier than propaganda. The heat melted brains. The monotony of the landscape drove men crazy. In this void, a man was left alone with his demons. And the demons whispered, "Kill or die. There are no rules." God stayed far to the south in the cool valleys. Here, only steel rules. By the time the fleet approached the coast, the army was no longer just a gathering of people. It was a pack. A dangerous, hungry, unpredictable pack that the officers barely held on a leash. The soldiers sharpened their knives. This sound, stones scraping against metal, became the soundtrack of waiting. They tested the sharpness of the blades on a fingernail, grunted with satisfaction, and hid the claws back in their sheaths. They were ready. They looked at the ocean, beyond which lay enemy land. There, ahead, fortified positions, cannons, and thousands of enemy soldiers awaited them. But the Rotos were not afraid. In their eyes burned that very spark of madness that so frightened foreign observers. They knew a secret unavailable to strategists in headquarters. War in the desert is not maneuvers. It is a fight in a dark alley. And in this fight, the winner is not the one with the prettier uniform, but the one who draws blood first. The ships cut the waves, approaching the landing point. In the holds hung the heavy smell of sweat, cheap tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Tension grew with every mile. It was a spring compressed to the limit, and when the shore finally appeared in the haze, the spring was ready to straighten out and strike with terrible force. A rumor passed among the soldiers. The landing would be hard. The shore was steep. The enemy was dug in on the heights. There would be no time to shoot.
"Means we'll work with our hands," someone said in the darkness of the hold, and the others picked up this chuckle.
No one yet knew that in a few hours, these people would change the very concept of an infantry attack. No one knew that right there, on the sandy slopes of Pisagua, a myth would be born that would make an entire continent tremble. The water overboard changed color from dark blue to turquoise. The depths ended. The death zone began. The boats hit the sand, and the ramps fell down with a crash, opening the way into the unknown. November 2nd, 1879. Remember this date. On this day, war ceased to be a chess game of generals and turned into a knife fight on a state scale. The operation at Pisagua, the first amphibious landing under heavy fire in modern history. Imagine you are standing on a narrow strip of beach. In front of you is the ocean. Behind you is a wall. Clay and sand slopes go up at an angle of 45 degrees. At the top, hundreds of meters above your head, sit Bolivian riflemen and Peruvian artillery. You are like targets in a shooting gallery to them. Nowhere to hide. Impossible to dig into the wet sand. Staying put means dying. Retreating means drowning. The logic of military science of that time dictated deploy a skirmish line, return fire, wait for naval artillery support. But the Chilean rotos hadn't read tactics textbooks. They did what no one expected of them, something that contradicted common sense. They ran. Not in an attack formation. They dashed up the loose dunes. Have you ever tried running up a mountain of dry sand? You take a step, and your foot slides half a step back. Sand fills your boots, your heart pounds in your throat, your lungs burn. And now add to this the whistle of bullets, explosions of shells tearing your comrades to pieces, and 40-degree heat. It was a vertical marathon of death. Shooting while running, scrambling on all fours up a sheer slope, is impossible. The rifle becomes a useless stick, extra weight pulling you down. And then it happened. As if obeying a collective instinct, hundreds of soldiers ceased to be riflemen. They slung their rifles behind their backs. With free hands, they grabbed onto rocks, roots of stunted bushes, the earth itself, pulling themselves up centimeter by centimeter. And what was in their teeth? Yes, exactly that image which would become a nightmare for the entire coast. The curved Corvo knife clamped between the teeth. The glint of steel right by the face. A beastly grin. It was not a command from headquarters. No manual prescribes climbing into machine guns with a knife in your teeth. It was the choice of the men themselves. They understood. When they got to the top, there would be no time to reload, no time to work the bolt. There would be only one strike. Look at this through the eyes of the defenders on the peak. Bolivian soldiers look down through their sights. They see a gray mass swarming below. They shoot, people fall, roll down in heaps, leaving bloody furrows in the sand. But the mass continues to crawl. It gets closer. It doesn't stop. And suddenly they notice a glint. Hundreds, thousands of small flashes of sun on metal. In that moment, primal horror settled in their souls. These were not soldiers. These were demons crawling out of the sea abyss. They didn't hide from bullets. They seemed to feed on them. The psychological effect was crushing. The defenders saw before them not an opponent who could be scared by fire, but an inevitable force of nature. How do you stop a tsunami with a rifle shot? The last meters of the climb were the scariest. The Chileans, choking on rage and exhaustion, spilled over the parapet of the enemy trenches. And right here, on a narrow patch of earth where you cannot turn with a long bayonet, the Corvo came into its own. The massacre began. The sounds of gunshots ceased. They were replaced by other sounds. Dull thuds, crunches, screams cutting off on a high note. It was not a battle. It was slaughter at a livestock farm. The curved blades worked with terrifying efficiency. A downward strike behind the collarbone, a side strike ripping the belly, an upward strike to the groin. The Corvo, thanks to its shape, allowed strikes from any angle, in the cramped space, in the melee where bodies were intertwined in a single ball. The Chilean miners fought silently. They saved their breath for the strikes. Their faces were covered in a crust of sweat, dust, and foreign blood. There was nothing human in their eyes, only dilated pupils and emptiness. The Bolivians, unaccustomed to such savagery, threw down their weapons. They tried to run, but the Corvo caught up with them. The hook snagged a leg, a shoulder, toppled them to the ground. Foreign observers watching the battle from ships through spyglasses later wrote in their reports that they had never seen such fury. They called it heroism, but in private letters they used other words. Rabies. Possession. They saw soldiers, having already captured the trench, continue to strike the bodies of fallen enemies. as if they wanted to kill them twice, 3 times, as if they were taking revenge not on specific people, but on fate itself for driving them into this desert. By sunset, Pisagua fell. The sand on the slopes turned crimson. But victory brought no relief. When the adrenaline subsided, the victors looked at their hands. They were sticky. They looked at their knives. The steel had dulled. That evening, it was quiet by the fires. No one sang songs. Soldiers sat staring into the fire, mechanically wiping blades with rags. They had just passed a baptism by blood. They realized they were capable of things they had previously been afraid to even think about. They had stepped over the line, separating a civilized man from a barbarian. And the scariest thing, they liked it. The feeling of absolute power over another person's life. Power given by a short, curved blade. In the trenches of Pisagua, not only the enemy garrison died, the innocence of an entire generation died there. They realized that moral rules work back in the cities, where there are police and judges. But here, at the edge of the world, the law is one. Whoever strikes first is the one who lives. But this was only the beginning. Pisagua was merely the foyer of hell. Ahead awaited the real underworld. The soldiers looked east, deep into the continent, toward where the shimmering heat hid a deadly trap. They thought the worst was behind them. They were wrong. The desert had only tasted them, and it liked the taste. In headquarters, arrows were already being drawn on maps, sending regiments deep into the territory, into narrow stone sacks where there is no water, but plenty of despair. There, in the scorching gorge of Tarapacá, a trial awaited them that would break the last remnants of their sanity. A trial where ammunition would run out sooner than enemies. And then the Corvo would become not just a weapon, but the only hope for salvation. November 27th, 1879, Tarapacá. If hell exists on Earth, then on that day it was located in this narrow, scorching gorge. This isn't even a battlefield. It is a stone bag, a deep ravine scorched by the sun, where the air temperature is such that you could fry eggs on the rocks. And inside this bag, a Chilean detachment found itself trapped. The situation, it couldn't be worse. From above, from the commanding heights, Peruvians are showering them with lead. No way out. No reinforcements coming. No water. But the worst part comes after noon. Click. This dry metallic sound is scarier than the roar of cannons. It is the sound of a firing pin striking an empty casing. Another click. And another. The fire of the Chilean infantry begins to die down. First, rare shots, then silence. The ammunition has run out. Supplies were left somewhere far away in the desert, cut off by the enemy. By all laws of military science, this is the end. Checkmate. In such a situation, any European officer would take out a white handkerchief, tie it to a saber, and go to negotiate an honorable surrender. This is logical. This is rational. It saves lives. The Peruvians up top understand this too. They stop the squall of fire, awaiting capitulation. They look down into the dusty haze of the gorge and wait for the parlementaires. But they forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot that down there, in that stone coffin, sat not career military men raised on chivalric romance novels. Sitting there were miners from the Atacama, people whose logic works differently. For a Roto, surrender is not an option. It is worse than death. It is an admission that you are a weakling, and in their world, the weak do not live long. Instead of a white flag, another sound hung over the gorge. Not loud, but one that made blood run cold, even in 40-degree heat. Clang. Rustle. Thousands of blades leaving their sheaths simultaneously. The officers might have wanted to surrender, but they saw the eyes of their soldiers. In those eyes, there was no fear, only the cold, dull rage of a cornered beast. The soldiers throw away useless rifles. They don't need them anymore. They take off heavy packs. They roll up their sleeves. And that is when the most inexplicable event of that war begins. An event that historians still cannot fit into the framework of tactics. The counterattack of the dead. Without a single shot, with only cold weapons, the Chileans rush up the slope.
Into machine guns, into the full magazines of the enemy.
Is it suicide? Absolutely. But it is a suicide that turns into murder. Imagine you are a Peruvian rifleman on the crest of a hill. You have a full bag of ammo. You feel like the master of the situation. And suddenly you see a wave of people with knives rushing at you from below, out of the dust. They don't shout, "Hurrah!" They growl. They climb up sheer cliffs, clinging with fingers, tearing off fingernails, and continue to climb. You shoot. One falls. A second falls. But the third keeps running, and he is already close. You see his face. It is twisted in a grimace that has nothing to do with military discipline. He is looking not at your uniform, not at your weapon. He is looking at your throat. In this moment, a psychological fracture occurs. How do you fight someone who wants to get to you with their hands? How do you stop someone who doesn't give a damn about their own death as long as they take you with them? Rational fear of a bullet is replaced by irrational terror of primitive cruelty. The Peruvian ranks faltered, not because there were fewer of them, not because they had worse weapons. They faltered because they encountered absolute, inhuman rage. When the distance closed to zero, the meat grinder began. In close contact, a rifle is an awkward club, and the Corvo is an extension of the wrist. Chileans dove under bayonets. They slipped into dead zones. The hook-shaped blade worked like a predator's claw. It snagged, tore, opened up defenses. One strike, and the opponent is on the ground. A second strike, and he won't get up. Witnesses described this scene as an invasion of demons. It seemed the desert itself spawned these creatures from sand and hatred. The air filled with the heavy, metallic smell of blood, which overpowered even the smell of gunpowder. It was an orgy of violence. People who half an hour ago were doomed to captivity or death now turned into executioners.
They were taking revenge for their fear, for the thirst, for the hopelessness.
The Battle of Tarapacá did not end as the staff maps predicted. The Chileans didn't just break out of the trap, they overturned an enemy superior in numbers and technology. But the price of this victory was not in the killed and wounded. The price was elsewhere. It was in the gorge of Tarapacá that the myth was finally born, the myth of the demons of the desert. Rumors of this battle flew along the entire coast faster than the telegraph. Peruvian soldiers told each other in whispers by the fires that Chileans didn't need bullets, that they fed on blood, that their knife was an enchanted amulet that sought the target itself. Fear of the Corvo became a material factor of the war. It demoralized entire garrisons before the first shot. The enemy knew, if it came to hand combat, there was no chance. There is no countering brute force, and there is no defense against the Corvo. But the victors themselves changed too. Climbing out of that ravine, they left the remnants of their humanity there. They realized that rage is a currency that is valued higher than gold here. They tasted impossible victory, won not by intellect, but by animal instinct. And this taste intoxicated them. When the dust over Tarapacá settled, one thing became clear. The rules of war were cancelled permanently. There would be no more maneuvers and beautiful gestures. Ahead was only total war of annihilation. A war where no prisoners are taken. The flywheel of cruelty spun up to full power, and it was already impossible to stop it. Next stop, the Valley of Tacna, the place where the concepts of soldier and murderer would merge into one under the black flag of death. May 26th, 1880. The Valley of Tacna. If before this we talked about skirmishes, raids, and desperate breakthroughs, then forget about that now. Here, on the so-called Field of the Alliance, war dropped its last mask. It stopped pretending to be a noble duel of nations and showed its true, ugly face. It was a meat grinder, the largest, bloodiest clash of that war. 20-something thousand people on one side, almost 15,000 on the other. Artillery thundered so hard that soldiers bled from their ears. The earth trembled as if in a fever. But the scariest thing was not the roar. The scariest thing was the air. By noon, the sun disappeared. It wasn't an eclipse. It was dust. Thousands of boots, hooves, and wheels raised tons of dried-out sand into the sky. Mixing with the thick, oily smoke of black powder, this suspension turned day into twilight. Visibility dropped to zero. Officers lost control. Generals went blind. In this dirty yellow fog, regiments, battalions, and companies disappeared. Only shadows remained. And when the distance between the armies shrank to a stone's throw, the cannons fell silent.
Not because they ran out of shells,
but because they couldn't shoot. Friend and foe were mixed together. That ominous pause set in. A second of silence when the heart skips a beat. And then a sound swept over the battlefield that made even veterans' hair stand on end. The signal of a bugle. Sharp, shrill, alarming. The musicians blew the air out of their lungs, and with it, the remnants of mercy. This signal was called a degüello. In Spanish, this means to the cutting of the throat. In the language of military manuals, it means take no prisoners. The black flag. Total destruction. Do you hear? This is not a call to attack. This is a call to execution. From that moment, Tacna ceased to be a battle. It turned into a giant slaughterhouse. In the dusty haze, where one uniform could not be distinguished from another, the rifle lost its meaning. Reloading took too long. Aiming was impossible. The bayonet gets stuck in ribs and breaks, and then, obeying that very bugle signal, thousands of hands reached for their belts. The Corvo became the main caliber of this battle. Imagine this chaos. You don't see the enemy until he is half a meter away from you. You smell only sweat and fear. Out of the fog flies a hand with a hook, a strike, a sob. The shadow disappears to appear again. Here in the crush, where people crushed each other, the curved blade was king. Peruvian and Bolivian soldiers trying to fight back with rifle butts were doomed. The Chilean Roto, with a knife in hand, entered this chaos like a fish in water. He dove under the swing. He used the crowd's inertia. He struck blindly, knowing that in such a crush it was impossible to miss. The hook ripped, tore, snagged. Historians like to write about tactical maneuvers at Tacna, about flanking movements, about the heroism of standard-bearers. But the truth they shamefully hide behind beautiful words lies elsewhere. The victory at Tacna was not forged in headquarters. It was carved by hand. It was mechanical work. Soldiers stepped over bodies, slipped on ground wet with blood, got up and went on. They had no time for emotions. They had no time for pity. The signal adegueo relieved them of moral responsibility. They were allowed to be beasts. They were ordered to be beasts. And they carried out the order with frightening diligence. Who is the real monster here? The soldier who, maddened by the smell of blood, finishes off the wounded with a knife? Or the general who, sitting in the safe rear, gives the order to raise the black flag, knowing it will unleash the darkest instincts? At some point, the Peruvian defense simply burst. It didn't retreat, it crumbled. People ran not from the enemy army, they ran from the horror of close combat.
They saw what their comrades turned into after meeting the condor's beak.
The fear of being slaughtered like cattle proved stronger than the fear of being shot for desertion. By evening, the dust began to settle. What opened to the eyes of the survivors made many look away. The earth had changed color. The field of the Alliance was strewn with bodies so thickly that it was impossible to walk without stepping on a corpse. And the nature of the wounds spoke for itself. The majority died not from bullets. The Chilean army standing amidst this nightmare was no longer the one that landed at Pisagua. At Pisagua, they were daring adventurers. At Tarapacá, hunted beasts. At Tacna, they turned into professional executioners. They looked at their knives as extensions of their own will. They realized there was no force that could stop them in close combat. The victory was complete. The allied army of Peru and Bolivia ceased to exist as a unified force. Bolivia effectively exited the war, crawled away into its mountains to lick its wounds. Peru was left alone. But for the Chilean soldiers, this was not the end. Intoxicated by blood, feeling their impunity, they looked further. To the south, where the fortress of Arica towered on an impregnable cliff, the last stronghold, the Gibraltar of the Pacific. Officers tried to bring them to their senses, return them to formation, force them to clean their uniforms. But in the soldiers' eyes burned that same fire that could no longer be extinguished. They didn't want rest. They wanted continuation. They liked the taste of absolute power given by adegueo. In headquarters, they said Arica was impossible to take, that there were minefields, forts, powerful artillery, and a garrison ready to stand to the death. The Chilean rotos listened to these conversations and only gripped the handles of their Corvos tighter. For them, the word impossible no longer existed. Only the word forward existed. They did not yet know that the assault on Arica would be not a battle, but a sprint to hell. 55 minutes that would forever enter history as an example of the most effective and criminal assault of all time. Speed multiplied by cruelty. While the dust settled in the desert, hiding the traces of the massacre, a new act of this tragedy was being prepared on the coast. And the main role in it was again to be played by a curved piece of steel. 55 minutes. Mark the time on your watches. That is less than a school lesson or a lunch break. Exactly that much time was required for the Chilean army to achieve the impossible. To turn an impregnable stronghold, against which, according to the calculations of military engineers, any attack should have shattered, into a mass grave. June 7th, 1880. Arica. Look at the rock El Morro. It is not just a mountain. It is a natural bastion sticking out of the ocean 130 meters up. Sheer walls. At the top, heavy artillery capable of blowing any ironclad to splinters. Approaches are blocked by a complex system of trenches and forts, and, most importantly, minefields. Peruvian engineers turned the approaches to El Morro into a technological hell. They buried hundreds of landmines in the sand, connected by electric wires. One press of a button at the top, and an entire regiment was supposed to fly into the air. It was the perfect defense. Logical, scientific. But they again made the same fatal mistake. They tried to apply logic against a force of nature. The assault on Arica did not look like a battle. It was a sprint race against death. When the Chilean regiments, the 3rd and 4th line, received the order, something strange happened. The officers were just taking a breath to command a tactical formation, but the soldiers had already bolted.
They were driven not by patriotism. They were driven by the inertia of Tacna. They were warmed up by the previous slaughter. They knew, the faster you run, the less chance you'll get hit. And then the mines went off. Imagine that sound, the dull, uterine roar of the earth. Fountains of sand, rocks, and human bodies shot into the sky. The first line of attackers simply vanished in a fiery cloud. By all rules, the attack should have choked. Soldiers should have hit the dirt, pressed into the ground, retreated. This is the normal reaction of a living being to the sudden death of comrades. But the Rotos didn't hit the dirt. The effect turned out to be the exact opposite. The sight of the torn bodies of friends didn't scare them. It switched off their last safety fuses. Fear burned up in an instant flash of rage. Instead of stopping, they accelerated. They ran straight through the minefield. Forward!
Those bastards are blowing us up with buttons are up there!
This silent scream hung over the field. The soldiers realized the only way to survive was to get to the enemy's throat before he pressed the next button. It was a race. Who is faster, a running man or an electrical signal along wires? Man won. The Corvo again played its decisive role. Rifles were useless in this mad dash. Chileans flew into the Peruvian trenches at the foot of the cliff like cannonballs. They didn't shoot, they chopped. The speed was such that the defenders simply didn't have time to react. Curved blades flashed in the dust, clearing the path upward. And then began the climb to the summit, to the plateau of El Morro itself. It was no longer a battle of armies. It was a tsunami crawling up the rocks. Officers lost their voices trying to shout orders. No one listened to them. The army turned into a single organism, possessed by one goal: to get to the top and destroy everything living.
When they burst onto the plateau, the agony began.
The Peruvian garrison fought bravely. Their commander, Colonel Francisco Bolognesi, promised to burn the last cartridge, and he kept his word. But coming against him were people who didn't need cartridges. What happened on the summit in the last minutes of the assault is hard to describe in military terms. It was a punitive action. Chileans, crazed by mine explosions, by running, by the sight of blood, took no prisoners. They took revenge for every exploded landmine. They threw surrendered Peruvians off the cliff into the ocean. Hundreds of bodies flew down, smashing against the rocks of the surf. Officers tried to stop the massacre. Historical chronicles have preserved moments when Chilean captains and lieutenants literally threw themselves at their soldiers, knocking bloodied knives out of their hands, threatening them with revolvers. "Enough! Stop! They are surrendering!" they shouted. But the Rotos looked at them with empty, glassy eyes, and stepping around the commanders, continued their work. The beast released in the Atacama had completely gone out of control. It no longer distinguished orders. It knew only the taste of victory, and that taste was metallic. Colonel Bolognesi died right there, not in a heroic duel as they like to paint in pictures. He was beaten with rifle butts and finished off with knives in the general scrum. His body was later found among a pile of other corpses. It was not the death of an officer. It was the death of a victim in a back alley. When it was all over, silence hung over the summit of El Morro. Only the sound of the ocean far below and the cries of seagulls. and the heavy breathing of thousands of people. 55 minutes. The flag of Peru was torn down. The Chilean star rose in its place. But this triumph had the taste of ash.
The victors stood at the edge of the cliff, looking at the dark waters of the Pacific Ocean.
Their uniforms had turned into rags. Their faces were black with soot. Arica had fallen. The war in the south was over. There were no more obstacles. The desert was left behind. But where to direct this terrible energy now? Where to put this army that had learned to solve any problem with a swing of a curved knife? Soldiers wiped blades on grass or the clothes of the killed. They looked north. Toward where, beyond the horizon, in green valleys, lay the pearl of the continent. Lima, the city of kings. The city of gold, palaces, and women. In their minds, poisoned by impunity and blood, a new thought began to ripen. If we could take an impregnable rock in an hour, what is to stop us from taking the enemy's capital? What is to stop us from taking anything we want? Now they were not just soldiers. They felt like gods of war. Cruel, vengeful gods with dirty hands.
And these gods wanted their reward.
Lima was still sleeping, not knowing that approaching its gates were those whom the press would call barbarians, and history, victors. But victors of what? In this war, Chile won territory, but it seems it began to lose its soul. The wave raised in the desert rolled north to crash down on the pampered city and flood it with horror that South America had never seen. January 1881. If you thought hell was a scorching desert with no water, you were wrong. Hell can look like a garden of paradise. It can smell of jasmine, expensive French cognac, and burning mahogany. The Chilean army stood at the gates of Lima. Behind remained two bloody battles at Chorrillos and Miraflores. These were the last spasms of Peruvian defense. Militia, students, shopkeepers tried to stop the iron steamroller that came from the south. They couldn't. The road to the City of Kings was open.
And right here happened what smart generals feared, and what stupid politicians stayed silent about.
The spring, compressed by years of hardship, uncoiled. Imagine 20,000 men. They went through the hell of the Atacama. They saw their friends torn to pieces by mines. They killed people with knives, looking them in the eye. They forgot what a soft bed is, what law is, what pity is. And suddenly they find themselves in Chorrillos, a fashionable resort of the Peruvian aristocracy. They see marble villas. They see mirrors in gilded frames. They see cellars bursting with wines a Chilean miner couldn't even dream of. They see wealth accumulated over centuries. Wealth of those who, they were told, started this war. What happens when a hungry beast gets into a butcher shop where there is no shopkeeper? Discipline collapsed. It didn't just disappear, it evaporated in alcohol fumes. A bacchanalia began. The great victorious army turned into an uncontrollable horde of looters in a few hours. The Corvo, that faithful companion of the soldier in battle, found a new use. Now it wasn't opening enemy defenses, it was opening locks on the doors of rich mansions. It was knocking the necks off bottles of vintage champagne. It was ripping open the upholstery of velvet sofas to find hidden jewelry. It was threatening civilians. That night, Chorrillos burned. But it was not artillery fire. It was the fire of drunken madness. Soldiers who had lost their human semblance set fire to houses just for fun, just to see how beautifully expensive curtains burn. The streets filled with smoke, screams, and the sound of breaking crystal. Witnesses of those events described scenes that make one ashamed of the human race. Victors, staggering, wandered among the ruins, draped in stolen rags, drinking straight from the bottle, shooting in the air and killing. Killing not enemies, killing anyone who came to hand. And each other, too. Drunken quarrels over loot were settled instantly. One swing of a curved knife, and the argument is over. Yesterday's brothers in arms, who shared the last sip of water in the desert, now cut each other for a gold watch or a bottle of rum. But the worst crime was committed not against people, but against memory. When the army entered Lima itself, the barbarism reached its apogee. The National Library of Peru, the treasury of knowledge of South America, tens of thousands of rare books, manuscripts, historical documents. For an illiterate roto who spent his whole life in a mine, these books were just paper. Soldiers used priceless tomes to light fires for cooking stew. They tore out pages to roll cigarettes or use as toilet paper. Books lay in the mud, trampled by boots. Part was stolen and sent to Santiago as a trophy, but the greater part simply perished. It was the destruction of culture. The destruction of the soul of a defeated people. The officers were horrified. They realized they were losing the army. That instead of a military force, they had a band of robbers on their hands, disgracing the flag. Command tried to restore order in the only available way, with cruelty. On the streets of Lima and its suburbs, tragedies played out that they don't like to write about in patriotic education textbooks. Chilean patrols caught their own soldier looters. Field courts worked around the clock. The sentence was one: execution by firing squad. Imagine this picture. Against the wall of a burning mansion stands a group of drunk, dirty soldiers. On their uniforms are medals for Tarapacá and Tacna, and opposite them stand their own comrades with rifles at the ready. An officer, voice breaking, commands, "Fire!" A volley. War heroes fall into the mud, struck down by the bullets of their own fellow servicemen. This was the agony of victory. Chile won the war, but lost the peace. The very moment the first soldier kicked in the door of another's house, the beast, let out of the cage to defeat the enemy, was now devouring the army itself from the inside. Shame. This feeling hung over Lima thicker than the smoke of fires. The shame of officers who couldn't look foreign diplomats in the eye. The shame of soldiers who, in the morning, sobering up, discovered silver spoons and women's jewelry stained with blood in their knapsacks. The myth of the noble warrior was trampled by jackboots. The rotos showed that they could be not only heroes, but monsters. And the Corvo became the symbol of this transformation. From a weapon of fatherland defense, it turned into a highwayman's knife. But the euphoria from the fall of the capital and the drunken stupor could not last forever. While the victors divided the loot and shot looters, the war did not end. It just changed form. It left the cities. It left the palaces and squares. It went where the Chilean had no place, into the mountains. The defeated Peruvian army did not disappear. It dissolved into the fog of the Andes. General Andrés Avelino Cáceres, soon to be called the Wizard of the Andes, gathered the remnants of forces in the highlands. He understood. In open battle, the Chileans could not be beaten. Their knives were too sharp, their cannons too powerful. But the mountains are a different matter. The Chileans thought it was all over. They drank wine in Lima and wrote letters home about a speedy return. They didn't know that the real nightmare was just beginning. A nightmare in which there would be no front line. A nightmare where the enemy is invisible. and death comes from around every turn of a mountain path. There, in the freezing, thin air where it is hard to breathe, a completely different war awaited them. A war of ghosts. And in this war, their famous Corvos would collide with a force that cannot be cut with a knife.
With nature itself and the hatred of an entire people.
You thought the war ended with a parade in Lima. You thought that after the flags of the victors rose over the presidential palace, the soldiers laid down their arms and went home to hug their wives. What a naive mistake. War is a disease, and it has relapses far more terrible than the primary infection. Welcome to the Breña campaign. Welcome to the Sierra. There is no scorching sun of the Atacama here. There is no golden sand of the coast. Here there is only gray stone, icy fog, and altitude. 3, 4, 5,000 meters above sea level. The air here is so thin that the heart pounds in the chest like a bird in a cage, trying to pump oxygen to the brain. Mountain sickness. Soroche. It kills slowly, but ghosts kill even faster. The Chilean army, intoxicated by easy victories on the coast, moved deep into the Andes to finish off the remnants of the resistance. They walked like masters. But very soon the mountains explained to them who the real master was here. The enemy vanished. Instead of regular regiments lined up in a row, the Chileans were met with emptiness. General Andrés Avelino Cáceres, a man with the face of an Indian idol, went into the clouds. They nicknamed him the Wizard of the Andes, and he really did cast spells. He turned peasants, shepherds, and Quechua Indians armed with slings and old muskets into an invisible army of death. For the Chilean roto, used to an open wall-on-wall fight, this was a nightmare. Imagine walking along a narrow path over a precipice. To the left, a wall. To the right, an abyss. Fog hides everything beyond arm's reach. Silence. And suddenly from above, out of the whitish mist, falls not rain, but rocks. Huge boulders, released by an invisible hand, sweep entire platoons into the abyss. Without a single shot. Without a chance to answer blow for blow. This is a war of nerves. Guerrilla warfare.
The dirtiest of all possible.
Here, in the frozen hell of the Andes, the Corvo changed its function again. It ceased to be an assault weapon. It became an instrument of terror. Chilean soldiers, frozen, hungry, exhausted by constant fear, began to take their anger out on the local population. If the enemy won't come out to fight, we will force him to suffer through his land. Punitive expeditions began. Villages burned. Livestock was slaughtered. People were interrogated with prejudice, and the main argument in these interrogations was the curved knife. "Where is Cáceres? Where are the partisans?" the officer asked. The peasant was silent. He didn't understand Spanish or pretended not to. And then the roto with the Corvo stepped in. One cut. Thin, neat. A demonstration of intimidation. The psychology of intimidation worked flawlessly. The knife, which used to rip open soldiers' bellies in fair combat, was now used to carve information out of civilians. It was degradation.
Complete and final.
Soldiers wrapped themselves in stolen ponchos trying to keep warm, but the cold penetrated the soul. They began to see enemies in every shadow. Every turn of the path could be the last. Local women selling food could slip in poison. A shepherd boy could be a spotter. Paranoia became their constant companion. In response to terror, the partisans answered with the same. They took no prisoners. Chilean stragglers were found later, in such a state that even veterans of Arica turned pale. Mutilated bodies were left in plain sight as a message. Leave. This is not your land. The circle of violence closed. Cruelty bred cruelty. Chileans, feeling like trapped beasts in this stone labyrinth, became even more beastly. They set ambushes. They slaughtered entire farmsteads if they found even a single shell casing there. You know what is the scariest thing in such a war? Habituation. Murder became routine, like peeling potatoes. A soldier could wipe a bloodied Corvo on his pant leg and immediately start eating bread with the same hand. The boundaries of morality were erased completely. There were no more heroes and villains. There were only survivors and the dead. For 3 long years, this hunt for ghosts continued. For 3 years, the Wizard of the Andes led the best army in South America by the nose through mountain passes. For 3 years, the Chilean flag, soaked in desert dust, got wet under freezing rains and soaked in the blood of peasants. This campaign brought no glory. Songs were not composed about it. People tried to be silent about it. Because there was no greatness there. There was only the dirty, hard work of an executioner. When the war finally ended, when the peace treaty was signed, the soldiers came down from the mountains. They looked like ghosts, ragged, with empty eyes, aged 10 years. They won. Chile received its provinces, its saltpeter, its gold. But what did they get?
Those who held the knife? They descended to the ocean, leaving behind snow-capped peaks that became graves for thousands of their comrades. They thought the country would welcome them like gods, that the streets would be strewn with flowers, that the gold they conquered would rain down on their heads. What irony. They walked home clutching their faithful Corvos in their pockets, the only thing they had left. They didn't know that the country they killed for had already divided the loot, and in this division, no place was provided for them. The victors were not returning to palaces. They were returning to the same poverty they left. Only now, in this poverty, they had to live with the memory of what they did in the mountains, with the memory of screams in the fog, of the sound steel makes entering a defenseless body. Gold for the elite, poverty for the heroes. Ships were already waiting in the ports to take this broken army home, but the peaceful life they dreamed of in the trenches turned out to be scarier than war. Because in war, you have an enemy you can kill. And in peaceful life, your enemy is the system that used you and threw you away. Victory is a strange drink. At first, it intoxicates, sweeter than the most expensive wine. You feel like a giant. You walk the streets of Santiago under triumphal arches built in your honor. Girls throw flowers under the hooves of horses and the boots of infantrymen. Orchestras thunder with brass, drowning out the tapping of crutches. Newspapers scream about the greatness of the nation, about the Prussians of South America, about the new empire on the Pacific. It seems this holiday will be eternal, but the hangover comes quickly, and it turns out to be scarier than thirst in the desert. When the fanfares died down and the flowers withered, the Rotos discovered a simple and cruel truth. Chile had indeed become fabulously rich. The saltpeter they died for in the Atacama turned into a golden stream. Millions of pounds sterling flooded the country. The budget grew 4 times over. This was wild, unbelievable money. But this golden rain did not fall on those who shed blood. It fell on those who stayed home. Look at the palaces of Santiago of that era. Marble, imported granite, stucco, crystal chandeliers from Europe. Look at the Opera House, at bank accounts swelling in London and Paris. The Chilean aristocracy, the landed oligarchy, the mine owners bathed in luxury. They ordered champagne by the crate, dressed in the latest French fashion,
and discussed progress. And where were the heroes of Arica and Tacna at this time? They returned to where they came from, to the slums, to the rotten conventillos, tenement houses without windows or sewage, where 10 people huddled in one room. The veterans, by whose hands the empire was forged, turned out to be needed by no one.
Imagine a soldier who lost a leg on a minefield at El Moro. He returns home a hero. But a hero cannot work in a mine. A hero cannot load sacks at the port. And pensions? The state that so generously spent money on monuments turned out to be stingy with help for living people. Cripples with medals flooded the church porches. Yesterday's lions of the desert held out a hand for a coin, while lacquered carriages drove by, splashing them with mud from under the wheels. It was betrayal. Quiet, clerical, cynical betrayal. The Rotos became outcasts again. The elite, who just yesterday sang praises to their bravery in the newspapers, now wrinkled their noses in disgust. They are dirty. They are dangerous. They are drunks. Society got scared of the beast it had nurtured itself. These people had seen too much death to respect a police whistle or a private property fence. People were afraid to hire them. People shied away from them on the streets. And what was left for a hero to do? He went to the tavern, to a cheap chingana where cloudy wine was served and a guitar played. He drank to forget the screams of dying Peruvians that came to him in dreams. He drank to drown the pain in old wounds. He drank because looking at this unfair world sober was unbearable. And, of course, his faithful friend was with him, the Corvo. The knife no longer hung proudly on the belt. In peacetime, carrying weapons was forbidden. The knife migrated to a pocket, into a boot top, under a poncho. It hid, but it didn't disappear. It became a symbol of hidden malice. In these smoke-filled taverns, amidst the drunken stupor, a new, dark energy was born. Veterans looked at each other and understood. They were used. They were thrown into the furnace of war like coal, so that the locomotive of progress could whisk the rich away into a bright future. And the coal burned out and turned to ash. Fights became brutal. Scars from the Corvo now appeared not on the bodies of enemies, but on the faces of Chileans themselves. Knife fights became commonplace in nocturnal Santiago and Valparaiso. It was a cry of despair. If you can't hit the one who stole your life, the banker, the politician, the general, you hit the one next to you. A loser, just like yourself. The social chasm widened every day. On one side, balls, receptions, talk of high culture and trips to Europe. On the other, typhus, tuberculosis, high infant mortality, and hunger. "We gave you saltpeter, and you don't give us bread." This whisper grew louder. It sounded in the mining settlements, which were working at full capacity again, but labor conditions there became even worse. It sounded in the port docks. It sounded in the barracks, where soldiers saw how their commanders fattened. The aristocracy didn't want to hear this whisper. They thought money solved everything, that victory in the war wrote off all internal debts. They didn't understand that you cannot simply humiliate thousands of men who know how to kill with their bare hands. Tension accumulated for years. It was like static electricity before a storm. The air became heavy, glances prickly. The Corvo in the pocket became hot. The hand reached for the familiar rough handle itself when another nouveau riche in a top hat shoved a veteran with his shoulder on the sidewalk. An abscess was ripening in the country, and this abscess couldn't be cured with pills or reforms. It could only be lanced. History is an evil ironist. The weapon that brought Chile the most glorious victory in its history
was preparing to deal it the most terrible blow. The national hero, the Roto Chileno, with his legendary knife, stood on the threshold of becoming the national executioner. By the end of the 80s, the situation became critical. President José Manuel Balmaceda, a man of progressive views, tried to change something.
He wanted to use the wealth from saltpeter not only for palaces, but for schools, roads, for the people. He swung at the sacred, at the wallets of the oligarchy and British monopolies. And then the elite bared its teeth. Parliament rose against the president. The country split in two. It smelled not just of gunpowder, it smelled of civil war. The most terrible kind of war, where there are no strangers, where on both sides of the barricades they speak the same language, pray to the same God, and use the same weapon. Veterans drinking themselves to death in the slums raised their heads. They heard a familiar call, the call of blood. They were offered work again. They were told again that they were needed. Some to protect the lawful president, others to protect the freedom of Congress. But in reality, they were offered to release all that hatred that had been accumulating for 10 years. They were given a chance to take revenge. It didn't matter on whom. Just to take revenge on the world for their broken fate. And they took out their knives. Blades dulled by time demanded sharpening again. The demons of the desert woke up. But this time they were not looking north. They were looking into the faces of their brothers. The clock began the countdown to the moment when the nation would commit collective suicide. Only mere moments remained until the year 1891. The finale of the tragedy was inevitable. The year 1891. Winter in the southern hemisphere. Cold rains wash the dust from the streets, but they cannot wash away what is about to happen. This is the finale, the climax of our bloody opera. The moment when the snake finally bites its own tail and injects poison right into the heart. Civil war. The two scariest words in the history of any people. Scarier than a plague, scarier than an earthquake. Because in a civil war, there are no heroes. There are only killers and victims. And often, they are the same people. Chile split. President José Manuel Balmaceda against Congress. The army against the navy. Father against son. Brother against brother. This is not a metaphor from a bad book. This is the reality of August 91. Families were torn in half. Yesterday's fellow soldiers, who drank from the same canteen in the Atacama Desert together, now looked at each other through sights on opposite sides of the barricades. But the most terrible thing was not in politics. The most terrible thing was in who exactly met on the battlefield. On both sides stood veterans of the War of the Pacific, those very lions of Tarapacá, those very demons of Arica. People who went through the best school of killing on the continent. They knew all the tricks. They knew how to flank, how to endure pain, how to advance under fire. And they knew how to use the Corvo. Imagine the Battle of Concon, August 21st, foggy morning. The Aconcagua River. 10,000 men on one side, 9,000 on the other. Artillery begins the concert, but the outcome is not decided by cannons. The outcome is decided by the infantry. When the armies clashed in hand-to-hand combat, something monstrous happened. It was not a battle. It was a meeting of old acquaintances. "Do you remember me? We took Pisagua," shouts a soldier of the government troops. "I remember," answers a rebel from the Congressional Army. And they strike. Simultaneously. In that war, in Peru, the Chileans had an advantage. They were predators, and the enemies were prey. Here,
predators fought predators. The efficiency of destruction was absolute. No one asked for mercy because they knew there would be no mercy. They themselves canceled mercy 10 years ago in the desert. Now, this boomerang returned to take off their heads. The Corvo, this symbol of national pride, turned into an instrument of national suicide. The same moves, the same hook to the neck, the same ripping of the belly. Only now the blade cut the flesh of exactly the same Roto, with the same dark face, with the same calloused hands. Chilean steel drank Chilean blood with the greed of a vampire. A week later, the Battle of Placia, the last act of the tragedy. It was a slaughter, a real meat grinder where people were ground into mince with industrial speed. Balmaceda's soldiers, seeing they were losing, did not surrender. They fought with the desperation of the doomed because they knew captivity means execution. Have you ever seen an army destroy itself? Look at the field after the Battle of Placia. Corpses lay in several layers, and most wounds were inflicted by cold weapons. It was the work of masters of their craft. Gruesome, quality work. The result of this short but insane war is shocking. 10,000 dead Chileans. Think about this number. 10,000. This is more than Chile lost in all the years of war with Peru and Bolivia combined. More than in the Atacama, more than in the Sierra campaign. An external enemy could not kill as many Chilean soldiers as Chileans killed themselves in a couple of weeks. We created a perfect killing machine to defeat neighbors. And when the neighbors ran out, the machine began to devour its creators. We let the genie out of the bottle, gave him a curved knife, and taught him that pity is weakness. And the genie fulfilled all our wishes. He slaughtered all enemies. And then, for lack of others, he started on us. When the smoke over Placia cleared, President Balmaceda realized it was all over. He took refuge in the Argentine embassy. On September 19th, the day his mandate ended, he put on a black suit, lay on the bed, and shot himself in the temple. This shot put a period at the end of an era. The victors, supporters of Congress and the oligarchy, celebrated triumph. They drank champagne again. They divided ministerial portfolios, and in the ravines near Valparaiso, rotted the bodies of those who had obtained all the country's wealth with their own hands. The Roto Chileno fulfilled his historic mission. He conquered saltpeter for the masters. He defended their interests in the Civil War. And now, he became unneeded again. The Corvo returned to the sheath. But now there was a brother's blood on it. This blood cannot be wiped off with a rag. It ate into the metal. It poisoned the very essence of this weapon. From a farmer's tool, from a symbol of valor, it turned into the mark of Cain. The history of the Chilean knife is not just a history of a weapon. It is a mirror. A crooked, rusty, blood-spattered mirror into which the nation looks. And it sees there not a brave soldier in shining armor. It sees there a beast with mad eyes, ready to tear out the throat of anyone, even itself. We started this story with the question of how a simple tool became a curse. Now you know the answer. A weapon does not kill by itself. The hand that holds it kills. And the hand is controlled by an idea. The idea that the end justifies the means. That victory at any cost is a blessing. Chile paid this price. It received its lands, its money, its greatness. But somewhere there, in the depths of national memory, a scar remained. A scar in the shape of a curved condor's beak. It aches in damp weather. It reminds that the line between heroism and barbarism is thinner than a knife blade. And now, looking at this old, time-pitted piece of steel in a museum display case, ask yourself one question. A question to which there is no right answer. If, for the greatness of your country, you need to release the monster living inside each of us, are you ready for the fact that one day this monster will look at you not as a master, but as food?